when lonely rancher Benjamin Hayes heard a baby's desperate cries echoing across the desolate Wyoming plains in 1879, he never expected to find an abandoned infant that would change his life forever. But when territorial authorities arrived to take the child away, would Benjamin risk everything to protect the family he never knew he needed? The frozen wind cut through Benjamin Hayes like a knife as he rode across his empty ranch on that bitter November morning in 1879. His horse's breath made white clouds in the air while snow began to fall on the Wyoming hills. Benjamin pulled his old coat closer to his body and squinted through the storm at his cattle scattered across the frozen grass. Something felt wrong today. After 3 long years of living alone on this ranch, Benjamin knew every sound the wind made through the valley. He knew how his cattle called to each other when storms came. He knew the way coyotes howled at night and how owls sang in the darkness. But today, carried on the cold air, came a sound that made his heart beat faster. It was faint at first, like an echo bouncing off the rocky hills. Benjamin stopped his horse and listened hard. The sound came again, clearer this time. It was crying. Not the bawling of a lost calf or the howl of a wild animal. This was something else entirely. This was the cry of a human baby. Benjamin's hands shook as he held the leather reins. His wife Rose had died 3 winters ago, and since then he had heard many strange sounds in his loneliness. Sometimes his mind played tricks on him. Sometimes he thought he heard Rose calling his name from the kitchen of their small house. Sometimes he imagined children laughing in the yard where no children had ever played. But this sound was different. This sound was real. The crying came from somewhere beyond the eastern fence line, where his property ended and the wild territory began. That land belonged to no one and everyone. Travelers passed through those plains heading west to California or north to Montana. Most were families looking for new homes and better lives. Some were running from trouble they had left behind. Benjamin urged his horse forward, following the sound across the snowy ground. The crying grew louder as he rode, and with it came a fear that gripped his chest like an iron band. Someone was in trouble out there. Someone small and helpless was calling for help in this frozen wasteland, where death came easily to those who were not prepared. He had been a different man once, before Rose died. He had been the kind of neighbor who helped when help was needed. He had been the kind of man who opened his door to strangers and shared his food with travelers. But grief had changed him. Grief had made him turn away from the world and focus only on keeping his cattle alive and his ranch running. Now, as the crying grew stronger, Benjamin felt something stirring inside him that had been sleeping for 3 years. It was the feeling that someone needed him. It was the feeling that he might be the only person close enough to help. The snow fell harder as Benjamin reached the fence line that marked the edge of his property. He could see tracks in the snow leading away from the main trail that travelers used. The tracks were old, maybe a day or two, and partly covered by fresh snow. Someone had left the safe path and headed into the dangerous country beyond. Benjamin dismounted from his horse and tied the reins to a fence post. He climbed through the wire fence and began walking through the deep snow, following the sound of crying that now filled the air like a siren's call. His boots crunched through the frozen surface, and the wind whipped snow into his eyes until he could barely see. The crying stopped suddenly, and Benjamin's heart nearly stopped with it. He stood perfectly still in the swirling snow, straining his ears for any sound. Had he imagined it all? Had his lonely mind finally broken completely? Then, just as he was beginning to doubt himself, the crying started again. It was weaker now, as if whoever was making it was running out of strength. Benjamin pushed through a stand of small pine trees, their branches heavy with snow. On the other side, he found what he was looking for. There, in a small clearing, sat the remains of a camp. A fire had burned there recently, but now only cold ashes remained. Scattered around the dead fire were the broken pieces of someone's life. A torn piece of cloth, a wooden spoon, a child's shoe small enough to fit in Benjamin's palm. And there, wrapped in a dirty blanket beside the cold fire pit, was the source of the crying. A baby lay alone in the snow, its tiny fists waving in the air as it called out to an empty world. The child could not have been more than 6 months old, with bright blue eyes and hair the color of wheat. Benjamin dropped to his knees beside the baby, his hand shaking as he reached out to touch the small face. The child's skin was cold but not frozen. Someone had wrapped the baby well before leaving it here. But where was that someone? Where were the parents who should have been caring for this helpless little life? Benjamin lifted the baby into his arms, and the crying stopped almost immediately. The child looked up at him with those bright blue eyes, and Benjamin felt something crack open in his chest that had been frozen solid for 3 years. This tiny person was alive and warm and real, and for reasons he could not understand, Benjamin was the one who had found him. The baby made soft, cooing sounds as Benjamin held him close to his coat. The little hands grabbed at Benjamin's shirt, and tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb with surprising strength. Benjamin had never held a baby before. He and Rose had never been blessed with children of their own, though they had hoped and prayed for them during their 10 years together. Now, holding this abandoned child in his arms, Benjamin felt both wonder and terror. What was he supposed to do? How was he supposed to care for something so small and helpless? He was a cattle rancher, not a father. His hands were better suited to fixing broken fences and doctoring sick cows than changing diapers and mixing bottles. But as the baby settled against his chest, Benjamin knew he could not simply walk away. This child had been left here to die, and somehow Benjamin had been the one to hear his cries. Perhaps it was chance. Perhaps it was something more. Either way, the baby was now his responsibility. Benjamin began searching the abandoned campsite for clues about what had happened here. Behind a fallen log, he found an overturned wagon with one wheel missing. The wagon's contents were scattered across the ground. Clothes, pots and pans, a Bible with pages torn out by the wind, and toys that had belonged to children. Near the wagon, Benjamin discovered a small wooden cross pushed into the frozen ground. Hanging from the cross was a woman's wedding ring, thin and worn but still shining in the gray light. Beside the cross, someone had piled stones in a careful mound. Benjamin understood immediately what he was looking at. This was a grave. The story became clear as Benjamin pieced together the evidence. A family had been traveling west when their wagon broke down in this remote place. Someone had died here, probably the baby's mother based on the wedding ring. The father and any other children had continued on, perhaps thinking the baby would not survive the journey ahead. Or perhaps the father had died too, and other travelers had taken in the older children but could not care for an infant. Benjamin looked down at the baby in his arms and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "I guess you're coming home with me, little one," he whispered. The baby smiled for the first time, and Benjamin felt his heart break open completely. The ride back to the ranch house took twice as long as usual. Benjamin rode slowly, trying not to jostle the baby too much. He had wrapped the child in his own coat, leaving himself shivering in the wind. But the baby seemed warm and content, sleeping peacefully against Benjamin's chest as the horse picked its way carefully through the snow. Benjamin's ranch house sat in a valley between two low hills, protected from the worst of the winter winds. It was not a large house, just 4 rooms and a kitchen. But Rose had made it beautiful, with curtains on the windows and flowers in pots during the summer. Since her death, Benjamin had let the house grow dark and cold. He used only the kitchen and his bedroom, leaving the other rooms closed and empty. Now, as he approached the house with the baby in his arms, Benjamin saw it through different eyes. This would need to be a home again, not just a place where a lonely man ate and slept. There would need to be warmth and light and all the things that children needed to grow and thrive. Benjamin carried the baby into the kitchen and laid him gently on the table while he built up the fire in the stove. The house had grown cold during his absence, and he wanted to make sure the baby stayed warm. As the fire caught and began to heat the room, Benjamin faced his first real challenge as an unexpected father. The baby was hungry. Benjamin could tell by the way the little mouth opened and closed and the frustrated sounds that were starting to build toward another crying spell. But what was Benjamin supposed to feed him? He had coffee and hardtack biscuits and salt pork, none of which seemed suitable for someone who did not yet have teeth. Benjamin remembered that his neighbors, the McBride family, lived about an hour's ride to the north. Elena McBride had 6 children of her own and would know what to do. But the snow was falling harder now, and night was coming fast. The journey would be dangerous in this weather, especially carrying a baby. Then Benjamin remembered something else. In the back of the pantry, left over from the days when Rose had baked bread every week, was a can of condensed milk. Rose had used it sometimes when their cow was not giving enough milk. Perhaps it would work for the baby if Benjamin mixed it with warm water. As Benjamin prepared the makeshift formula, the baby began to cry again. But this time, the sound did not fill Benjamin with fear or sadness. Instead, it filled him with purpose. This tiny person was depending on him, trusting him to provide food and warmth and safety. For the first time since Rose's death, Benjamin had a reason to get up in the morning that went beyond simply surviving another day. The baby drank the milk eagerly, making happy sounds between gulps. When he had finished eating, he fell asleep in Benjamin's arms, his tiny chest rising and falling with peaceful breaths. Benjamin sat by the fire, holding the sleeping child and watching the snow fall outside the kitchen window. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be diapers to change and more meals to prepare. There would be neighbors to tell and decisions to make about the future. But tonight, in the warm glow of the firelight, Benjamin Hayes was no longer the loneliest man in Wyoming territory. Tonight, he was a father. Benjamin's horse stumbled on a hidden rock, nearly throwing both rider and baby into the frozen dirt. The sudden jolt made Daniel cry louder than before, his tiny voice cutting through the prairie wind like a knife. Benjamin gripped the reins tighter, his heart racing as he realized just how helpless he truly was. The baby, whom Benjamin had started calling Daniel after his own father, held onto his shirt with surprising strength as they rode toward the ranch house. Benjamin's mind spun faster than a tornado. What did he know about raising a child? Rose had always been the one who cooed over babies when they visited neighbors. His own hands, rough from years of rope burns and cattle branding, seemed too big and clumsy for something so small and fragile. Daniel's crying grew weaker, which worried Benjamin even more than the loud wails. The baby's face was turning red from the cold November air, and his little fingers felt like ice chips against Benjamin's chest. Every few minutes, Benjamin would look down and whisper, "Hold on, little fellow. We're almost home." But home felt farther away than it ever had before. When they finally reached the ranch house, Benjamin's heart sank. The wooden structure that Rose had once filled with warmth and laughter now looked empty and unwelcoming. Frost covered the windows, and no smoke came from the chimney. He had been so focused on his daily ranch work that he had forgotten how cold and lonely the place had become. Inside, Daniel's cries echoed off the bare walls like ghosts from the past. Benjamin set the baby gently on Rose's old rocking chair, but Daniel immediately started screaming again. The sound made Benjamin's hands shake as he tried to think of what to do next. "Food," Benjamin muttered to himself. "Babies need milk." But all he had was cow's milk in the root cellar, and he had heard somewhere that regular milk could make babies sick. His pantry held only salted beef, dried beans, and hard biscuits, nothing suitable for an infant who couldn't even sit up properly. Benjamin picked up Daniel and began pacing the kitchen floor. The baby's cries seemed to get louder with each step. Sweat beaded on Benjamin's forehead, despite the cold air seeping through the cabin walls. He had faced down angry bulls and survived blizzards that killed grown men, but this tiny human being left him feeling more helpless than he had ever been in his life. Then he remembered the McBrides. Elena McBride lived 15 miles north, near Willow Creek, with her husband Caleb and their 6 children. She had always been kind to Rose, bringing over fresh bread and staying for long conversations about everything from recipes to the weather. If anyone would know what to do with a baby, it would be Elena. The sun was already setting, painting the sky orange and purple, by the time Benjamin saddled his horse again. He wrapped Daniel in one of Rose's old quilts, a blue and white pattern she had sewn during their first winter together. The fabric still smelled faintly of the lavender soap Rose had loved. The ride to the McBride homestead felt longer than any journey Benjamin had ever taken. Daniel cried for the first few miles, then fell into an exhausted sleep against Benjamin's chest. The silence was almost worse than the crying, because Benjamin couldn't tell if the baby was still breathing. Every few minutes, he would stop his horse and check to make sure Daniel was still alive. When they finally saw the warm yellow light glowing from the McBride windows, Benjamin felt like a drowning man who had spotted a rescue boat. Smoke curled from their chimney, and he could hear the happy sounds of children playing inside. It was everything his own home used to be, before grief had settled over it like a heavy blanket. Elena McBride opened the door before Benjamin could even knock. Her round, kind face showed shock, then immediate worry as she took in the sight of the tall, weather-beaten rancher holding a crying baby. "Benjamin Hayes, what in the world?" she started to say. "Found him," Benjamin said, his voice hoarse from the cold ride. "His parents are gone. He needs things I don't know how to give him." Elena's motherly instincts kicked in faster than lightning. She took Daniel from Benjamin's arms and immediately began checking him over with practiced hands. "Poor little thing is half frozen," she said, rushing inside. "Caleb, heat some milk, quickly." The McBride house was everything Benjamin remembered: warm, noisy, and full of life. 4 of Elena's children gathered around to stare at the unexpected baby, while the youngest 2 peeked out from behind their mother's skirts. Caleb, a sturdy man with gentle eyes, hurried to follow his wife's instructions without asking questions. Within minutes, Elena had Daniel fed, cleaned, and wrapped in a warm blanket. She settled him in a makeshift bed, using a large wooden bowl lined with soft cloth. The baby's eyes grew heavy, and for the first time since Benjamin had found him, Daniel looked peaceful. "He's maybe 6 months old," Elena said quietly, watching the baby sleep. "Healthy, though skinny. Someone's been taking good care of him up until recently." Benjamin told them about finding Daniel by the abandoned campsite, about the overturned wagon, and the small grave marker with the wedding ring. Elena listened with tears in her eyes, while Caleb nodded grimly. They had heard too many stories like this one, travelers who didn't survive the harsh journey west. As Benjamin prepared to leave with Daniel sleeping safely in his arms, Elena caught his sleeve. Her expression was serious, almost worried. "Benjamin, you can't raise a child all by yourself out there," she said softly, glancing toward her own children. "It's not natural for a man alone. Babies need more than just food and shelter." Benjamin looked down at Daniel, who was sleeping peacefully for the first time since they'd met. The baby's tiny hand had somehow found its way around Benjamin's finger, holding on tight even in sleep. "Maybe not," Benjamin said, his jaw set with the same determination that had helped him survive 3 hard winters of grief. "But leaving him to die wasn't natural either. I'll figure it out." Elena shook her head, but she didn't argue further. Instead, she packed a bag with baby clothes her own children had outgrown, along with instructions for feeding and caring for an infant. As Benjamin rode away into the dark November night, he could feel Elena watching from her window, worry written across her face. Back at his ranch house, Benjamin built up the fire until the main room glowed with warmth. He set Daniel's makeshift bed near the fireplace and settled into Rose's old rocking chair to keep watch. The baby slept deeply, occasionally making soft sounds that tugged at Benjamin's heart. For the first time in 3 years, Benjamin wasn't alone in his house. The silence that had haunted him since Rose's death was broken by the gentle breathing of another human being who needed him. It was terrifying and wonderful at the same time. But as he watched the firelight dance across Daniel's peaceful face, Benjamin couldn't shake Elena's worried words. What did he really know about raising a child? The rooster's crow at dawn sounded like a warning bell to Benjamin, who had barely slept an hour all night. Daniel had woken up crying 3 different times, and each time Benjamin had fumbled around in the dark, trying to remember Elena's hurried instructions about warming milk and changing diapers. The first 2 weeks tested every bit of strength Benjamin thought he had, then demanded more. Daniel's needs seemed to change by the hour. Sometimes he wanted to eat, sometimes he wanted to be held, and sometimes he cried, for reasons Benjamin couldn't figure out, no matter how hard he tried. Benjamin's daily ranch work, once as regular as clockwork, became a crazy puzzle. On Monday morning, he left Daniel sleeping peacefully in his crib to go milk the cow. By the time he returned 20 minutes later, Daniel was screaming so hard his face had turned purple. The milk sat forgotten on the kitchen table, while Benjamin spent an hour trying to calm the baby down. Tuesday brought a new challenge, when Daniel somehow managed to wiggle out of his diaper during the night. Benjamin woke up to find his bed, his clothes, and most importantly, Daniel soaked and smelly. It took 3 attempts, and most of Elena's spare baby clothes, before Benjamin figured out how to pin a diaper tight enough to stay on, but loose enough not to hurt. By Wednesday, Benjamin's prize bull had broken through the fence, because Benjamin had been too tired to check the posts properly. He spent 4 hours chasing the enormous animal across the prairie, while Daniel cried from the baby carrier strapped to Benjamin's chest. His neighbor, old Jeremiah Stone, helped drive the bull back home but gave Benjamin strange looks the whole time. "Never seen a cowboy work cattle with a baby before," Jeremiah said, scratching his gray beard. "Might want to think about what you're doing here, Hayes." Thursday nearly broke Benjamin's spirit completely. Daniel refused to eat all morning, crying every time Benjamin brought the bottle near his mouth. By afternoon, Benjamin was so worried he saddled his horse and rode back to the McBride place, convinced something was terribly wrong. Elena took one look at Daniel and started laughing, not mean laughter, but the kind that comes from recognizing something familiar. "He's teething," she explained, showing Benjamin how to feel the tiny bumps on Daniel's gums. "Hurts like the dickens. Here, try this." She handed Benjamin a clean piece of cloth soaked in cold water. When Daniel bit down on it, his crying stopped like magic. But Friday brought the biggest test yet. Benjamin was mending a broken gate when he heard an odd silence from the house. Daniel had been babbling happily in his crib just minutes before. Benjamin dropped his tools and ran inside to find Daniel had somehow rolled himself over and gotten stuck face down in his blankets. The sight of the baby struggling to breathe sent ice through Benjamin's veins. He scooped Daniel up, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold on. Daniel coughed and cried, but he was breathing normally. Benjamin realized how close he had come to losing the child through his own inexperience. That night, Benjamin moved Daniel's crib into his own bedroom and lay awake listening to every sound the baby made. He had faced down rustlers and survived blizzards, but the responsibility of keeping this tiny person alive felt heavier than anything he had ever carried. Yet something strange and wonderful was happening too. Despite all the chaos and exhaustion, Benjamin found himself talking to Daniel constantly throughout their days together. "See that red-tailed hawk up there, little man?" Benjamin would say as they rode the fence line together. Daniel, secured in the carrier Elena had helped him make. "Rose always said they were signs of good luck. Maybe she sent you to both of us." Daniel would respond with gurgles and squeals that seemed to mean something, even if Benjamin couldn't understand what. The baby's eyes would follow Benjamin around the cabin, and his face would light up with a toothless grin whenever Benjamin appeared after being outside. By the end of the first month, something remarkable had happened. Benjamin's morning routine now included warming Daniel's milk before he even thought about coffee. His evenings were spent reading aloud from the old books Rose had loved, with Daniel sitting on his lap, chewing on his own fingers and listening intently to the sound of Benjamin's voice. The ranch work was getting done, though not always on schedule. Benjamin had learned to plan his days around Daniel's eating and sleeping times. Some tasks took twice as long because he had to stop and tend to the baby, but others went faster because Daniel's presence gave Benjamin a reason to hurry home. Winter was coming to the Wyoming territory, and Benjamin found himself planning ahead in ways he hadn't done since Rose died. He ordered extra supplies from town, not just for himself, but for Daniel too. He chinked every gap in the cabin walls to keep out drafts, and built a special windscreen around Daniel's crib. The baby was growing stronger and more alert every day, his blue eyes so much like Rose's that it sometimes took Benjamin's breath away, would track movement around the room. His laughs, when they came, sounded like pure joy, and could turn Benjamin's worst days into something bearable. One evening in December, as snow began to fall outside the cabin windows, Benjamin sat in Rose's old rocking chair, with Daniel on his lap. The baby was fighting sleep, his eyes drooping, then snapping open again, as if he didn't want to miss anything interesting. "You know what, little fellow?" Benjamin said quietly, adjusting the blanket around Daniel's shoulders. "I think we're going to be just fine together." Daniel looked up at him with those serious blue eyes, then yawned and settled against Benjamin's chest. For the first time since Rose's death, Benjamin felt something that might have been happiness stirring in his heart. But outside, the winter wind was picking up, and Benjamin had no idea that spring would bring visitors who would threaten to tear apart the family they were slowly building together. The hardest test was still coming. A thunderclap shook the ranch house windows as 3 horses appeared through the morning mist like ghosts from a bad dream. Benjamin's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips when he spotted the official badges glinting on the riders' coats. Daniel was playing with wooden blocks on the kitchen floor, building towers and knocking them down with delighted giggles, completely unaware that strangers were coming to take him away. The lead rider was a woman dressed all in black, sitting straight as a fence post in her saddle. Her sharp eyes swept across the ranch like a hawk searching for prey. Behind her rode 2 men, with serious faces and leather folders tucked under their arms, the kind of papers that could change a person's whole world, with just a few words written in fancy ink. Benjamin set down his cup and walked slowly to the front door. His heart hammered against his ribs like a woodpecker on oak bark. He had always known this day might come, but knowing something and being ready for it were 2 completely different things. "Mr. Hayes?" The woman's voice cut through the morning air like a sharp knife through butter. She dismounted with practiced ease, her boots hitting the ground with purpose. "I am Mrs. Victoria Ashford from the Territorial Children's Welfare Society." The name hit Benjamin like a punch to the stomach. He had heard whispers about Mrs. Ashford in town, how she traveled from ranch to ranch, taking children away from families she deemed unfit. Some folks called her an angel of mercy. Others had different names for her, none of them kind. "Ma'am," Benjamin replied, keeping his voice steady, even though his insides felt like they were tumbling down a rocky hillside. Mrs. Ashford's gaze moved past him to where Daniel had appeared in the doorway, his small hand clutching a wooden horse. The boy's blue eyes were wide with curiosity, not fear. He had never learned to be afraid of strangers, because Benjamin had always protected him from anything that might cause harm. "We've received reports about an abandoned child in your custody," Mrs. Ashford continued, pulling out an official-looking document. "According to territorial law, you have no legal right to care for this boy." The words hit Benjamin like hailstones in a summer storm. He stepped protectively in front of Daniel, who had wandered closer to see the visitors. "Daniel isn't abandoned. He's my son." One of the men behind Mrs. Ashford snorted like an angry bull. "Found him out in the wilderness, didn't you? That doesn't make you his father any more than finding a stray calf makes you its mother." Benjamin's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had worked too hard and loved too deeply to let some government people steal away the most important thing in his life. "I've been caring for him for 6 months. He's healthy, happy, and loved. What more does a child need?" Mrs. Ashford's expression softened slightly, like ice beginning to melt in spring sunshine, but her voice remained firm as winter iron. Mr. Hayes, caring for a child requires more than good intentions. This boy needs proper schooling, medical care, and social opportunities he cannot receive in this remote location. Daniel tugged on Benjamin's pants leg, sensing the tension in the air even if he couldn't understand the grown-up words being spoken above his head. Benjamin reached down and scooped the boy into his arms, feeling the comforting weight of him against his chest. "Look around you," Benjamin said, his voice growing stronger. "This ranch has everything a child needs to grow up strong and decent. Fresh air, honest work, and neighbors who care about each other." Mrs. Ashford surveyed the modest homestead with critical eyes. She saw the weathered wood, the simple furnishings, the rough-hewn life of frontier people. Benjamin could almost hear her thoughts. This was no place for a civilized child to grow up. "Mr. Hayes," she said carefully, "I can see that you care for the boy, but caring and providing proper care are different things entirely. The territory has facilities designed specifically for children, like Daniel, orphans, who need structured environments and educational opportunities." The word orphan stung Benjamin like a wasp. Daniel wasn't an orphan. He was a Hayes, part of a family that had chosen each other when the world had left them both alone. "He's not going anywhere," Benjamin said quietly, but with the kind of quiet that meant business. The second official stepped forward, his hand resting on the legal papers like a gunslinger ready to draw. "Sir, we have the authority to remove the child immediately. You can cooperate, or we can involve the territorial marshal." Daniel buried his face against Benjamin's neck, finally understanding that these strangers wanted to take him away from the only home he had ever known. His small arms tightened around Benjamin's neck like a drowning person clinging to a life rope. Benjamin's mind raced faster than a spooked Mustang. He needed help, and he needed it quickly. His neighbors had always been good people. But would they stand up to territorial officials for the sake of one man and his found son? "Elena!" he called toward the McBride homestead, where he could see Elena hanging laundry on the line. "Elena, I need you." Mrs. Ashford frowned at this delay, but she waited. As Elena hurried over, her face creased with worry. Behind her came her husband Caleb, wiping his hands on a work rag. "What's all this about?" Elena asked, looking from Benjamin to the officials and back again. "They want to take Daniel away," Benjamin said simply. Elena's face went pale as fresh milk. She had watched Benjamin transform from a broken widower into a loving father over the past months. She had seen Daniel's joy and Benjamin's renewed purpose. The thought of separating them was like suggesting they tear down the mountains. "That's the most foolish thing I've ever heard," Elena declared, planting her hands firmly on her hips. "Benjamin Hayes is one of the finest men in this territory, and Daniel is the happiest, healthiest child you'll find anywhere." Caleb nodded his agreement. "That boy's got everything he needs right here. Love, security, and a father who would move heaven and earth for him." Mrs. Ashford listened to their testimonies with growing uncertainty. She had expected to find a rough bachelor neglecting a foundling child. Instead, she was discovering a community that had rallied around an unlikely family. But rules were rules, and the territory had procedures for good reasons. Too many children had suffered in unsuitable homes for the government to make exceptions based on sentiment alone. "I appreciate your loyalty to Mr. Hayes," she said diplomatically, "but the welfare of the child must come first. Daniel needs stability, education, and opportunities for his future that cannot be provided in this isolated location." Benjamin looked down at Daniel, who was now crying softly against his shoulder. The boy's tears soaked through Benjamin's shirt and straight into his heart. He had lost Rose to circumstances beyond his control, but he would not lose Daniel to bureaucratic rules and cold regulations. The confrontation was far from over, and Benjamin knew the real battle was just beginning. "Ma'am, you're making a terrible mistake," Elena McBride said, stepping closer to Mrs. Ashford with the fierce determination of a mother bear protecting her cubs. "I've raised 6 children of my own, and I know what good parenting looks like when I see it." Mrs. Ashford straightened her shoulders, clearly uncomfortable with being challenged by a frontier woman in a patched apron. "Mrs. McBride, I'm sure you mean well, but the territory has trained professionals who understand child development better than a mother," Elena interrupted, her voice rising like thunder before a storm. "Better than neighbors who see this child every day, laughing and learning and growing stronger?" The sound of approaching horses interrupted the heated exchange. Benjamin's heart lifted as he recognized the riders, Jeremiah Stone from the neighboring ranch, followed by the Patterson family and old Doc Murphy from town. Word traveled fast in ranching country, and it seemed the entire community was rallying to Daniel's defense. Jeremiah dismounted, with the creaking protest of old bones and weathered leather. At 73, he was the unofficial elder of their small community, a man whose word carried weight even in territorial courts. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, tipping his hat with old-fashioned courtesy, "I hear you're planning to take young Daniel away from his father." "Mr. Hayes is not the child's legal father," Mrs. Ashford replied, though her voice lacked its earlier certainty. "He found the boy abandoned and has been caring for him without proper authorization." Jeremiah's weathered face creased into what might have been a smile. "Authorization? Ma'am, out here we don't need government papers to do what's right. When a child needs a home and a good man opens his heart, that's authorization enough." Doc Murphy stepped forward, his medical bag in hand. "Mrs. Ashford, I've been doctoring in this territory for 20 years. I've examined Daniel 3 times since Benjamin found him, and I can tell you that boy is in perfect health. He's gained weight, grown taller, and shows all the signs of a well-cared-for child." Mrs. Ashford looked around at the growing crowd of neighbors, her confidence wavering like a candle flame in a strong wind. She had expected to deal with one stubborn rancher, not an entire community united in opposition to her mission. "Dr. Murphy," she said carefully, "physical health is only one aspect of a child's well-being. What about education, social development, cultural refinement?" Young Mrs. Patterson spoke up, bouncing her own toddler on her hip. "Daniel's learning his letters from Benjamin every night. He can count to 20 and knows the names of all the animals on the ranch. What more does a 3-year-old need?" "Structure," Mrs. Ashford replied firmly. "Routine. Professional care from trained educators who understand child psychology." Benjamin had been listening to the debate swirl around him like wind in a dust devil, but now he stepped forward with Daniel still in his arms. "Mrs. Ashford, may I show you something?" She nodded reluctantly, curious despite herself. Benjamin set Daniel down on the porch and knelt beside him. "Daniel, can you show these nice people your letters?" The boy, who had stopped crying but was still sniffling, looked uncertain. Benjamin encouraged him with a gentle smile. "Go ahead, son. Show them what you've learned." Daniel walked over to where he had left his wooden blocks scattered on the porch. With careful concentration, he began arranging them in a line. BEN, JAMIN. "Papa," Daniel said proudly, pointing to the letters. The gathered adults watched in amazement as the 3-year-old continued spelling out words he had learned during evening lessons by lamplight. Rose, horse, home. Mrs. Ashford stared at the blocks, then at Daniel's bright, intelligent face. This was not the neglected, ignorant child she had expected to find. "That's impressive," she admitted grudgingly. "But education involves more than basic spelling. This child needs exposure to literature, mathematics, science, and social graces that cannot be taught by an untrained rancher." Benjamin stood slowly, his jaw set with quiet determination. "Mrs. Ashford, I may not have fancy degrees or government training, but I know how to raise a child with love, respect, and moral values. Isn't that what really matters?" "Love doesn't teach mathematics," Mrs. Ashford replied. "Love doesn't provide medical care when it's needed. Love doesn't prepare a child for life in civilized society." Doc Murphy cleared his throat. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but I've seen plenty of children from civilized society who were lacking in the very qualities this boy has in abundance: kindness, curiosity, and genuine joy in life." Caleb McBride stepped forward, his usually quiet voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Mrs. Ashford, my wife and I have been talking about expanding our children's education. We've been planning to bring in a proper school teacher to serve all the families in this area. Daniel would be included, of course." This was news to Benjamin, but he saw the wisdom in Caleb's quick thinking. A formal school would address many of Mrs. Ashford's concerns while keeping Daniel close to home. "A one-room schoolhouse with an untrained teacher is hardly what I would call adequate education," Mrs. Ashford said, but her tone was less certain than before. Elena stepped forward with a letter in her hand. "Actually, ma'am, we've already been corresponding with Miss Catherine Wright from Denver. She's a certified teacher with experience in frontier education. She's agreed to come teach our children starting this fall." Mrs. Ashford examined the letter, her frown deepening as she read the impressive credentials of the proposed teacher. "This is better than I expected," she admitted. "But there are still concerns about social development, cultural opportunities, and long-term prospects for the child." Benjamin felt a spark of hope. Mrs. Ashford was no longer talking about immediate removal IYDA. She was discussing concerns that could be addressed over time. "Mrs. Ashford," he said respectfully, "I understand your worries. But look at Daniel now. Really look at him. Does he seem like a child who's lacking anything important?" All eyes turned to Daniel, who had grown bored with the adult conversation and was now chasing a butterfly around the yard, his laughter ringing out like silver bells in the morning air. He was the picture of a happy, healthy child. Not bright-eyed, rosy-cheeked, and full of the boundless energy that comes from feeling completely secure and loved. Mrs. Ashford watched the boy for a long moment, and Benjamin saw something shift in her expression. The stern government official was seeing what everyone else had been trying to tell her, that sometimes the best institutions are not buildings with official seals, but homes built on love and supported by caring communities. "There would have to be regular inspections," she said finally, "monthly reports on the child's progress, and at the first sign that his welfare is being compromised, you'll have complete cooperation," Benjamin promised, hardly daring to believe that victory might be within reach. But Mrs. Ashford held up one hand. "I haven't made my final decision yet, Mr. Hayes. I need to see more of how you've arranged things for the child's care." The battle wasn't over, but for the first time since the officials had arrived, Benjamin felt like they might actually win this fight for their family. Mrs. Ashford stepped closer to Benjamin, her eyes studying his weathered face like she was reading a map. "Show me everything, Mr. Hayes. How this child lives, what he eats, where he sleeps." Her voice carried a challenge that made Benjamin's stomach twist into knots. The small group followed Benjamin through the front door of his ranch house. Daniel toddled beside them, his tiny hand gripping Benjamin's rough fingers. The wooden floors creaked under their boots as they moved from room to room. Benjamin felt like he was on trial, with every corner of his home being judged. "This is where Daniel eats," Benjamin said, pointing to a small wooden chair he had built. The chair was the perfect size for Daniel, with careful grooves carved into the arms where the boy could rest his little hands. Mrs. Ashford ran her fingers along the smooth wood, testing its strength. Elena McBride spoke up from behind them. "Benjamin made that chair himself. Took him 3 weeks to get it just right." Her voice was proud, like she was talking about her own family. They moved to the kitchen next. Benjamin opened a cupboard filled with small bowls and cups, all sized for tiny hands. "Daniel eats what I eat, just cut up smaller," he explained. "Soft bread, cooked vegetables, milk from our cow." Mrs. Ashford nodded, making notes in a small book she pulled from her coat pocket. The officials followed them upstairs to Daniel's room. Benjamin pushed open the door, revealing the nursery that had once been Rose's sewing space. Sunlight streamed through clean windows, lighting up the wooden toys scattered across the floor. A mobile, made of carved horses, hung above the crib, turning slowly in the gentle breeze. Daniel broke free from Benjamin's hand and ran to his toy box. He pulled out a wooden horse, holding it up to show Mrs. Ashford. "Horse," he said proudly. his blue eyes sparkling with joy. The stern woman's face softened just a little bit. "Where did these toys come from?" she asked, picking up a hand-carved train. "Made them during the long winter nights," Benjamin answered. "Daniel likes to line them up and make noises like they're real." As if to prove his point, Daniel began making train sounds, pushing his wooden engine across the floor. Mrs. Ashford knelt down to Daniel's level. "What's your favorite toy, little one?" she asked in a gentle voice that surprised everyone in the room. Daniel thought for a moment, then ran to a shelf and grabbed a small wooden bird. "Papa made this when I was sick," he said, holding it carefully. "It sings like the real birds outside." Benjamin felt his throat tighten. He remembered that terrible week when Daniel had burned with fever, and how he had carved that bird while sitting up all night, watching over the boy. "He was real sick last winter," Benjamin said quietly. "That little bird helped him feel better." The group moved back downstairs to the main room. Mrs. Ashford noticed a pile of books on a small table near the fireplace. She picked up the top one, its pages worn from many readings. "You read to him?" "Every night before bed," Benjamin said. "Rose always said books could take you anywhere in the world. I figured Daniel should know about places beyond these hills, even if he's too young to travel there yet." Daniel climbed onto Benjamin's lap and pointed to his favorite book. "Tell the horse story, Papa," he demanded, making everyone in the room smile despite the serious situation. Mrs. Ashford sat down across from them. "Read to him now," she said. It wasn't a request. Benjamin opened the book to a well-loved page about a wild Mustang running free across the plains. His voice was steady as he read, and Daniel snuggled closer, pointing at the pictures and making excited sounds when his favorite parts came up. The officials watched this daily ritual, seeing how the rough rancher became gentle when caring for his son. When the story ended, Daniel slipped down from Benjamin's lap and walked over to Mrs. Ashford. Without warning, he climbed up onto her knees and looked straight into her eyes. "You stay for dinner?" he asked with the innocent hope that only children possess. For the first time since arriving, Mrs. Ashford truly smiled. Her stern expression melted away as Daniel settled comfortably against her, completely trusting this stranger. "He's not afraid of new people," she observed. "Never has been," Elena said from the doorway. "That boy treats everyone like family until they prove otherwise. Benjamin's taught him well." Mrs. Ashford looked around the room again, but this time she wasn't searching for problems. She was seeing a home filled with love, simple but complete. The wooden furniture might not be fancy, but it was built with care. The house might be small, but every corner showed signs of a child being cherished. "Mr. Hayes," she said slowly, still holding Daniel on her lap, "love alone doesn't always make a proper home for a child." Benjamin's heart sank, thinking she was about to take Daniel away. "But sometimes," she continued, "it's exactly what makes a home perfect." The official papers stayed folded in her coat pocket. As the sun began to set, Mrs. Ashford stood up, gently setting Daniel back on his feet. "There will be legal steps to complete," she told Benjamin. "Proper adoption papers, official guardianship documents. But this child belongs exactly where he is." That night, after the visitors had gone, Benjamin tucked Daniel into his crib as always. The boy's sleepy voice drifted up in the darkness. "Papa, was the scary lady really scary?" Benjamin smoothed Daniel's hair and smiled. "No, son. She was just making sure you were safe and happy. And now she knows you are." 2 springs had passed since that frightening day when strangers came to take Daniel away. Now, in 1882, the Wyoming territory buzzed with talk of statehood and railroad expansion. But Benjamin Hayes cared more about the sound of his 3-year-old son's laughter echoing across their thriving ranch. "Papa, Papa, come see!" Daniel's excited voice carried from the chicken coop, where he spent most mornings collecting eggs and naming each hen. Benjamin set down his hammer and walked over to find Daniel crouched beside a small pile of straw, his eyes wide with wonder. "What did you find, little man?" Benjamin asked, kneeling beside his son. "Baby chickens," Daniel whispered, as if speaking too loudly might scare the tiny yellow chicks that had just hatched. 3 fluffy babies peeped softly under their mother's protective wing. Daniel reached out one finger to gently touch the nearest chick, his face glowing with pure joy. This was how most of their days started now. Daniel would wake up before sunrise, eager to begin his adventures around the ranch. He had grown tall and strong, with legs that could run faster than Benjamin thought possible, and arms that seemed to reach for everything in the world with curious excitement. "Can I hold one, Papa?" Daniel asked, his voice full of hope. "Better let Mama Hen take care of them for now," Benjamin said. "But you can watch them grow bigger every day." Daniel nodded seriously, already understanding that some things needed patience and gentle care. They walked together toward the house, where breakfast waited on the kitchen table. Benjamin had learned to cook simple meals that Daniel enjoyed, though he still missed Rose's skill with biscuits and gravy. Daniel climbed into his special chair and began eating his scrambled eggs, chattering between bites about his plans for the day. "After breakfast, we visit Mama Rose," Daniel announced, as if this wasn't something they did every single morning. "I picked flowers yesterday and saved them in water so they stay pretty." Benjamin's heart still squeezed tight when Daniel talked about Rose, but it was a good kind of pain now. The boy had never known Rose alive, but Benjamin made sure she was part of their daily life through stories and pictures and these morning visits to her grave on the hill. They walked hand in hand up the gentle slope behind the house, Daniel carrying a small jar filled with wildflowers he had carefully selected. The wooden cross that marked Rose's resting place stood strong against the morning sky, surrounded by the flowers from hundreds of previous visits that had taken root and bloomed into a natural garden. "Tell Mama Rose about the baby chickens," Benjamin said as Daniel arranged his fresh flowers around the cross. "Mama Rose, we got 3 new babies today," Daniel said in his serious talking to grown-ups voice. "They're yellow and soft, and they make little peep sounds. Papa says they'll get bigger and bigger until they can lay eggs too. Maybe next year they'll have babies of their own." Benjamin listened to his son's chatter, marveling at how Daniel had filled the empty spaces in his life without ever knowing they had been empty. The ranch that once felt too quiet now rang with constant noise. Daniel's questions, his laughter, his endless stream of observations about everything from clouds to bugs to the way horses moved their ears. "Papa, why do you think Mama Rose sent me to you?" Daniel asked suddenly, a question that caught Benjamin off guard. Benjamin thought carefully before answering. Daniel was smart for his age, always asking questions that made Benjamin think harder than he expected. "Maybe she knew we both needed each other," he said finally. "You needed someone to take care of you, and I needed someone to take care of." Daniel considered this seriously, then nodded like it made perfect sense. "Elena says families don't always start the same way, but they always end up with love." Elena McBride had become like a grandmother to Daniel, teaching him letters and numbers while Benjamin worked with the cattle. Her own children adored their young neighbor, and Daniel had learned to read faster than anyone expected. The whole community had watched him grow from a helpless baby into a bright, curious boy who seemed to belong exactly where he was. "Race you back to the house," Daniel suddenly shouted, taking off down the hill with his short legs pumping as fast as they could carry him. Benjamin chased after him, letting the boy win by a few steps, just like always. The rest of their day followed the comfortable rhythm they had built together over 3 years. Daniel helped Benjamin check on the cattle, asking 100 questions about why cows did this or that. They mended a section of fence together, with Daniel holding nails and trying to hammer them straight. They ate lunch under the big oak tree near the creek, watching clouds drift overhead, while Daniel made up stories about what shapes he saw in them. As afternoon melted into evening, they sat on the front porch, while Benjamin whittled a new toy, and Daniel practiced writing his letters on a small slate board. The boy's tongue stuck out in concentration as he carefully formed each letter, determined to get them perfect. "Papa, when I grow up, will I be a rancher like you?" Daniel asked, looking up from his writing. "You can be anything you want to be, son," Benjamin said, setting down his carving. Rancher, teacher, doctor, anything that makes you happy. Daniel thought about this for a long moment. I think I want to help animals and people who are hurt, like you helped me when I was a baby. Benjamin felt his chest swell with pride, and love so strong it almost hurt. This little boy, who had started life abandoned and alone, had grown into someone who wanted to help others. That sounds like a fine thing to be, Benjamin said softly. As the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Benjamin realized that finding Daniel in that clearing 3 years ago had taught him the most important lesson of his life. Worth didn't come from what other people thought of you, or from avoiding pain and loss. Worth came from choosing to love despite the risks, from building something beautiful with whatever pieces life handed you. The cry in the wind had become a song of belonging, and Benjamin Hayes had finally discovered that home wasn't a place at all. It was the people you chose to love and protect with everything you had.